There was a pattern in history that has ended empires long before their enemies ever arrived at the gates. In 476 AD, Rome didn't fall in a single night. It bled out after decades of debt, currency collapse, and political paralysis. In 1947, Britain still ruled a quarter of the planet on paper, yet within 20 years, it had surrendered its empire, its currency dominance, and its global authority. In December 1991, the Soviet Union vanished without a major invasion, dissolved under economic strain, internal decay, and a system that could no longer sustain itself. Different centuries, different continents, identical endings. And right now, in 2025, the world's most powerful nation is moving through the exact same sequence. Not suddenly, not dramatically, step by step. And here's what should terrify you. Almost no one recognizes the pattern while they're inside it. They never do. This is the story of how empires really die, why it always happens in stages, and why empires don't collapse suddenly. They fade in threes. Predictable phases is not a warning about the past, but a map of where we are now. Before we go through this pattern and these examples, you need to understand what imperial collapse actually means. Not in textbooks, in practice. This isn't just about losing territory or surrendering flags. It is about a system reaching a point where it can no longer sustain the promises it has made to its people, its allies, and itself. At first, everything looks normal. Markets still function. Governments still speak confidently. Life appears stable on the surface, but underneath, the foundations are cracking. When this phenomenon begins, it doesn't announce itself with explosions or invasions. It arrives quietly, through balance sheets, through policy decisions, through slow erosion of trust. Here's what people get wrong. They imagine collapse as a single moment, a final battle, a dramatic fall. That's not how it works. It's not sudden. It's sequential. One weakness forces a temporary solution. That solution creates a larger weakness. And eventually, the system spends more energy surviving than building. That's not theory. That's documented history. Rome didn't collapse because of barbarians. Britain didn't collapse because of rebellion. The Soviet Union didn't collapse because of NATO. They collapsed because internal economic reality finally overwhelmed political illusion. And once this process starts, it accelerates. Confidence disappears faster than it was built. Capital moves faster than governments can react. And when the final phase arrives, it feels abrupt, only because the earlier phases were ignored. Let me show you how this sequence played out 3 times before, with dates, numbers, and decisions you can trace on a calendar, and why the same forces are active again today. Let's start with Rome. At its peak, around 117 AD, under Emperor Trajan, the Roman Empire controlled roughly 5 million square kilometers and governed more than 60 million people, nearly 1/4 of the world's population at the time. Its roads stretched over 400,000 kilometers. Its legions were unmatched. Its currency, the silver denarius, was trusted across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. Rome looked invincible. But by the late 3rd century, the pattern had already begun. The first stage emerged quietly. By 180 AD, after the death of Marcus Aurelius, Rome entered a period of political instability. In just 92 years, between 235 and 327 AD, Rome had more than 20 emperors, most of them assassinated. Each leadership crisis disrupted trade, taxation, and military command. To maintain control, emperors increased military spending. By 200 AD, the Roman army had grown to over 400,000 soldiers. Paying them required money Rome didn't have. So Rome did what overstretched powers always do. It debased its currency. In 211 AD, the denarius contained about 85% silver. By 260 AD, under Emperor Gallienus, silver content had fallen below 5%. Same coin, same stamp. Almost no silver. Prices exploded. A loaf of bread that cost 2 denarii in 200 AD cost 50 by 270 AD. Soldiers demanded higher pay. Merchants stopped trusting Roman money. Trade slowed. Tax collection collapsed. This wasn't an accident. It was policy. The second stage followed. To compensate for a worthless currency, Rome raised taxes. Aggressively. By the early 300s under Diocletian, taxes were assessed not just on land, but on professions, tools, and even family members. Farmers abandoned their land. Trade guilds collapsed. The middle class vanished. In 301 AD, Diocletian issued the edict on maximum prices, attempting to freeze wages and prices across the empire. It failed immediately. Goods disappeared from markets. Black markets exploded. Economic control replaced economic growth. And here's where it gets worse. To enforce these policies, Rome expanded bureaucracy. By 300 AD, the imperial administration had doubled in size compared to the 1st century. More officials, more enforcement, more cost, less productivity. Rome was now spending enormous resources just to keep the system running. The empire was no longer expanding. It was consuming itself. The third stage was the loss of confidence. By the late 4th century, Romans no longer believed the system would protect them. Wealthy citizens moved assets out of cities. Local elites stopped funding public works. Roads deteriorated. Aqueducts failed. In 376 AD, when Gothic refugees crossed the Danube seeking asylum, Rome lacked the logistical capacity to manage them. Corruption among officials turned a humanitarian situation into a crisis. 2 years later, in 378 AD, the Roman army suffered a catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Adrianople. Emperor Valens was killed. 40,000 soldiers were lost. Rome had not suffered a defeat like that in centuries. From there, the unraveling accelerated. In 410 AD, Visigoth forces led by Alaric sacked Rome itself. Not because Rome was weak militarily in theory, but because it could no longer fund, supply, or coordinate effective defense. The Western Empire fragmented. Provinces stopped sending taxes. Armies became local militias. By 455 AD, Rome was sacked again. And in 476 AD, when the last Western Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed, there was no dramatic collapse, no final battle, just silence. The system had already stopped functioning. From peak dominance to dissolution took about 3 centuries, but the critical damage occurred much earlier. Currency debasement led to inflation. Inflation destroyed trust, lost trust, crippled taxation. Crippled taxation weakened the military. And once confidence was gone, everything else followed. That's what imperial decline looks like in practice. Not sudden, not emotional, mathematical. Let's jump forward more than 1,500 years. The British Empire. At its height in 1913, Britain controlled territories spanning over 33 million square kilometers and ruled roughly 412 million people, about 23% of the world's population. London was the financial center of the world. The pound sterling was the global reserve currency. British shipyards built more than half of the world's merchant vessels. On paper, this was Rome reborn with steam engines and telegraphs, but the same pattern was already in motion. The first stage began with overextension. By 1900, Britain was maintaining naval dominance across every major ocean. The Royal Navy alone accounted for nearly 40% of global military spending. That power came at a cost. When World War I erupted in 1914, Britain entered a conflict it could not afford to fight indefinitely. By 1918, Britain had spent over $9 billion on the war. That was nearly 200% of its GDP at the time. To finance it, Britain abandoned the gold standard in 1914. For the first time in centuries, the pound was no longer fully backed by gold. Just like Rome, Britain chose survival over stability. After the war, Britain tried to pretend nothing had changed. In 1925, under Chancellor of the Exchequer Winston Churchill, Britain returned the pound to the gold standard at its pre-war value. It was a fatal mistake. British exports became uncompetitive overnight. Coal, steel, and textiles collapsed. By 1930, unemployment exceeded 20% in industrial regions. The empire was still vast, but the core economy was hollowing out. Just like Rome, appearance masked decay. The second stage arrived through debt and dependency. World War II finished what the First War started. By 1945, Britain was bankrupt. Its national debt had risen to over 250% of GDP. The country relied on $3.75 billion in loans from the United States under the Lend-Lease program, followed by another $434 billion loan in 1946. Adjusted for today, that's over $100 billion. Britain could no longer finance its empire without external support. Sound familiar? And here's the parallel. Just like Rome raised taxes and expanded bureaucracy, Britain increased state control. Industries were nationalized. Rationing continued until 1954, nearly a decade after the war ended. Living standards stagnated. Meanwhile, maintaining the empire became economically irrational. India, Britain's most valuable colony, gained independence in 1947. Within 2 decades, most of Africa and Asia followed. The empire wasn't conquered, it was liquidated. The third stage was loss of confidence in the currency. In 1949, Britain devalued the pound by 30% against the dollar. In 1967, it devalued again by 14%. Each devaluation made imports more expensive, reduced purchasing power, and signaled weakness to the world. Countries began holding dollars instead of pounds. The reserve currency mantle quietly shifted across the Atlantic. By the early 1970s, Britain was forced to seek a bailout from the International Monetary Fund. In 1976, the IMF provided a $3.9 billion rescue package. An empire that once financed the world now needed emergency loans. Different century, different technology, same sequence. Military overreach created debt. Debt forced monetary compromise. Monetary weakness destroyed confidence. And once confidence was gone, the empire could no longer justify its costs. Britain didn't fall in flames. It downsized under financial pressure. The same mistake that destroyed Rome closed in again. The pattern played out again. Now, let's look at the most recent example, the one many people alive today still remember, the Soviet Union. On paper, it was a superpower rivaling the United States. In 1975, the USSR controlled 15 republics, governed nearly 290 million people, and commanded the largest standing army on Earth with over 5 million active personnel. It possessed more nuclear warheads than any other nation. It put the first satellite into space in 1957. It sent the first human into orbit in 1961. From the outside, it looked permanent, unmovable, inevitable. But here's what should really concern you. The same pattern that took Rome centuries and Britain decades unfolded in the Soviet Union in just a few years. The first stage began with economic illusion. By the late 1960s, the Soviet growth model was already breaking down. Central planning prioritized heavy industry and military output, not efficiency or consumer demand. By 1970, nearly 25% of Soviet GDP was dedicated to military and defense-related production. That meant fewer resources for housing, food, and infrastructure. Productivity stalled. Innovation slowed. But instead of reforming the system, Soviet leadership masked the problem with statistics and oil revenue. In the 1970s, global oil prices surged. For a brief period, the Soviet Union benefited enormously. In 1980, oil and gas accounted for over 50% of Soviet hard currency earnings. That revenue hid structural weakness. Living standards appeared stable. The state kept its promises. But the economy underneath was brittle, just like Rome's silver, just like Britain's pound. The second stage arrived suddenly. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev took power and inherited an economy that could no longer grow. Soviet GDP growth had fallen below 2%. Life expectancy for men was declining. Alcoholism was widespread. Infrastructure was decaying. In an attempt to fix the system, Gorbachev introduced perestroika and glasnost, partial reform, limited openness. But here's the critical detail. Reforms destabilized the system faster than they could save it. Then, the oil price collapsed. Between 1981 and 1986, global oil prices fell by nearly 70%. Soviet export revenues collapsed with them. Hard currency reserves evaporated. By 1989, the Soviet government was running massive deficits it could not finance. Unlike the United States, the USSR could not borrow globally at scale. Unlike Britain, it had no financial allies willing to rescue it. The system began missing payments, stores emptied, lines grew longer, confidence shattered. This is where the pattern accelerates. In 1988, food shortages spread across multiple republics. In 1989, Eastern European satellite states began breaking away. Poland held semi-free elections. The Berlin Wall fell in November 1989. In 1990, Lithuania declared independence. The central government tried to hold everything together through force and decree, but the money was gone. Authority without resources is just noise. The third stage was collapse of belief. By 1991, no one trusted the system anymore. Not citizens, not regional leaders, not even the military. In August 1991, hardline officials attempted a coup to stop reforms. It failed within 3 days. The army refused to act. The police stood down. Power dissolved in real time. On December 25, 1991, Gorbachev resigned on national television. The Soviet flag was lowered from the Kremlin. The next day, the USSR formally ceased to exist. From global superpower to dissolution took less than 6 years from the first major reforms, and less than 18 months from visible crisis to total collapse. Rome took centuries. Britain took generations. The Soviet Union took months. That's the part most people miss. The pattern is accelerating. Each iteration collapses faster than the last because the systems are larger, more complex, and more interconnected. Once confidence breaks, there is no buffer, no slow fade, just rapid unraveling. 3 times, 3 empires, 3 collapses, all following the exact same sequence. Different ideologies, different technologies, different leaders, identical outcomes. And here's what should terrify you. The United States is following the exact same pattern, stage by stage, decision by decision, not as a theory, as a timeline. Stage 1 is monetary expansion to sustain overreach. For decades, the United States financed global dominance through debt. After 2001, military spending accelerated. Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, global basing across more than 80 countries. By 2010, the United States was spending over $700 billion a year on defense. By 2024, that number exceeded $880 billion. To pay for it, the system relied on borrowing. In 2000, total U.S. federal debt stood at $5.7 trillion. By 2010, it was $13.5 trillion. By 2020, it reached $27 trillion. By late 2024, it crossed $34 trillion. Same pattern, same solution. Print, borrow, extend, check. Stage 2 is currency dilution. After the 2008 financial crisis, the Federal Reserve expanded its balance sheet from under $900 billion to over $4.5 trillion. After March 2020, it exploded again. In just 2 years, the Fed added more than $4 trillion. By 2022, over 40% of all U.S. dollars in existence had been created within a 24-month window. That's not normal. That's emergency financing becoming permanent policy. Inflation followed. In June 2022, U.S. inflation officially hit 9.1%, the highest since 1981. Food prices rose over 25% between 2020 and 2024. Rent increased more than 30% nationwide. Wages did not keep up. Purchasing power collapsed quietly. Check. Stage 3 is rising interest costs consuming the system. As inflation surged, the Federal Reserve raised rates aggressively. By mid-2023, interest rates exceeded 5%. The consequence was mathematical. In 2024, the U.S. government spent over $1 trillion just on interest payments, more than national defense, more than Medicare, more than any single budget item except Social Security. Interest on debt now grows faster than GDP, just like Rome paying soldiers with debased coins, just like Britain servicing war loans. Check. Stage 4 is political paralysis. Every empire reaches a point where reform becomes impossible because the cost of reform is higher than the cost of delay. In the United States, this is visible in real time. In 2011, debt ceiling crises began. In 2013, the government shut down. No leader wants to be remembered as the one who cut benefits, raised taxes, or reduced global commitments. Stage 5 is loss of external confidence. This is the most dangerous phase because it happens silently. For decades, the US dollar functioned as the world's reserve currency. Oil was priced in dollars. Trade settled in dollars. Debt issued in dollars. But cracks are forming. In 2014, China and Russia signed currency swap agreements to bypass the dollar. In 2022, after sanctions froze Russian reserves, nations took notice. In 2023 and 2024, BRICS expanded to include Saudi Arabia, Iran, and others. Multiple bilateral trade agreements shifted away from dollar settlement. In 2000, the dollar accounted for over 70% of global reserves. By 2024, that figure had fallen below 60%, still dominant, but declining. Confidence doesn't vanish overnight. It leaks away. Check. Stage 6 is strategic retreat masked as choice. In August 2021, the United States withdrew from Afghanistan after 20 years of war. The withdrawal cost over $2.3 trillion in total expenditures. The Afghan government collapsed in 11 days. Equipment worth billions was abandoned. The message was unmistakable. The system had reached its limit. Since then, military commitments have been reassessed quietly. Allies are asked to contribute more. Red lines blur. Presence shrinks, just like Britain after 1947, just like Rome outsourcing defense to federati. Check. And here's the critical detail. We're not approaching the pattern. We're deep inside it. Every previous empire told itself the same story at this stage. Rome believed debasement was temporary. Britain believed the pound would recover. The Soviet Union believed reforms would stabilize the system. The United States believes growth will outpace debt. That technology will save it. That reserve status is permanent. The pattern says otherwise. Here's how the sequence continues, based on history. Stage 7 is internal strain becoming visible. When inflation, housing costs, healthcare, and education all rise faster than incomes, social cohesion fractures. Between 2020 and 2024, U.S. homelessness increased by over 12%. Household credit card debt surpassed $1.1 trillion. Auto loan delinquencies reached levels last seen in 2009. These aren't moral failures, they're system signals. Stage 8 is forced policy choice. Either allow inflation to run and destroy purchasing power, or raise rates and crush debtors. There is no third option. Rome chose inflation. Britain chose devaluation. The Soviet Union tried both and lost control. The Federal Reserve is trapped in the same box. You cannot print forever without consequences. You cannot borrow infinitely without repayment. Check. Stage 9 is acceleration. Once confidence in future stability breaks, behavior changes instantly. Capital moves, savings shift, consumption slows. Political extremes rise. This phase doesn't take centuries anymore. Rome had time. Britain had time. The modern financial system moves at digital speed. What once took decades now takes months. We are at stage 6 or 7, depending on how you count. The next stages are not mysteries. They're documented outcomes, reduced global influence, currency pressure, higher internal instability, and finally, a reordering of the system itself. This affects you directly. Your savings are denominated in currency. Your job depends on economic stability.